Can I ask you to come in and take your seats, please? Okay, I think we're going to try and make a start. For those who I haven't met yet, my name is Colin Becker. I'm with the Inland Waterways Association of Ireland. For my sins, I'm the editor of the in-house magazine Inland Waterways News. A couple of housekeeping things before we start. Can I just ask you to take note of the position of the emergency exits, and in the event of a sudden change in cabin pressure, oh no, sorry, that's a different one. They used to say on the corporate flights that I used to travel on, we were always told to remain in our seats and not to do anything that would impede the egress of the crew in an emergency. So I won't say that. Can I ask you again just to check that your phones are on silent and we won't have any embarrassing incidents like we had in the last session, and I won't name names. I also have an announcement, if you like, from an old friend of the waterways here in Ireland. I was talking a couple of days ago to Ruth Delaney, who many of you will know. Ruth, unfortunately, is not in great health at the moment, so she sends her apologies for not being here. She very much wanted to be here. She was very much associated with the 2001 conference, but unfortunately, her health just doesn't allow her to travel at the moment. So with that, we'll start with our first talk. Our first speaker is John McKeon, who will be well known to many of you as having been at various conferences over the years. John is a regional manager with Waterways Ireland, based at the Eastern Region office in Ashtown Gate in Dublin. He's been involved with waterways restoration for maybe more years than he likes to think at this point. But for 10 of those in particular, he was involved with the restoration of the Royal Canal, which was closed to navigation in 1961 and fully reopened again in 2010. So I think without further ado, I'm just going to let John go ahead and do his thing.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Colin. Good afternoon, fellow delegates. It's great to see you all here. As Colin says, my name is John McKeon. I'm Regional Manager with Waterways Ireland, and I've been involved in the restoration project on the Royal Canal for more years than I care to remember. Firstly, I'd like to give you a brief historical background of our inland waterways. Like any restoration project, it's a classic story, so it has a happy ending. The photograph you see on the screen there was conditions of lock gates that I would have come across back in 1987, and that's the 18th lock in Thomastown, where some of the Royal Canal Amenity Group Inland Waterways Association tried to staunch the gates by putting plastic up along them to try and actually keep water back in the levels again. We're going to cover 229 years in about 20 minutes, so I'll ask you to fasten your seatbelts and away we go. From the middle of the 18th century to the middle of the 19th century, there was an extensive network of inland navigations constructed in Ireland, mainly by governments and private corporations. And it was mainly there to provide an efficient means of transporting the goods that were transported on the poor road system at that particular time. But the network consisted of about 1,350 kilometres of canal, 270 locks, and many fine structures of arch bridges, aqueducts, weirs, siphons, and culverts. It was proposed in the 1715 Act of Parliament that a large number of the rivers in all 4 provinces in Ireland were to be made navigable and were going to be linked via a series of navigable channels. While the main act was to develop the bogs and wasteland of the Midlands, it was envisaged that the opening of the navigation canals and rivers would improve the communication throughout the country. Work began on the Royal Canal in 1755, whenever the Irish Parliament authorised the surveys to be carried out. 2 possible lines emerged: the Sullery route through Tullamore, County Offaly, and the more northerly one through Mullingar. Eventually, the Sullery route was chosen, and that begun in 1756, and that was the Grand Canal. Some 30 years later, it was the directors of the Grand Canal Company, one of them took umbrage and left one of the meetings and decided, I'm going to build a bigger and better canal myself. He walked out of the board and said this rival canal would beat all canals, and that was the start of the Royal Canal. There was a promise of €130,000 in subscriptions, and the charter was signed on the 24th of October 1789, and it was referred to earlier in some of the speeches about the 200th anniversary of the opening of the canal was celebrated last year in 1817 to 2017. Work began in 1790 with very little preliminary work. There was cuttings through Carpenterstown Quarry, Ryewater Aqueduct had to be constructed. Thomastown was reached in 1805, and ahead of that there was 8 locks, a flight of locks of 8 locks to bring it up to the summit level. On the summit level in 1806, Mullingar was reached. In the hallway there, in the reception, you probably see these contract documents. If you haven't, it's worth going to see them. But they are John Colally. He surveyed the route westwards, and David Henry, Bernard Mullins, and John McMahon were the constructors of that canal, from Coolnahay right through to Abbeyshrew. It was a big undertaking at that time, and as I say, with minor adjustments, it actually made the date and in contract time and price. The Longford branch was opened in 1830 as well. Spencer Dock then was opened in 1873, which is much later, and with the Midland Great Western Railway Company purchasing most of the canal, it was the adjacent lands that they were interested in order to put the railway going westwards. In 1986, the control of the canals moved over from CIE to the Commissioner of Public Works under the Canals Act of '86. We had various rallies along the canal and various moves to various departments, as you can see on the slide there. And we're now with Waterways Ireland, which was a north-south implementation body set up under the Good Friday Agreement. And we're in charge of 7 of the main navigable waterways throughout Ireland. And that's the 7 there. The canal itself, you can see here, that's the Royal Canal here going from Dublin. Does that show on the screen there, no? No. Royal Canal goes right through here, up to Mullingar, then takes a northerly route to Richmond Harbour and Clondra. Construction of the Royal Canal was to prove long and expensive, and there was approximately 90 miles was in the region. It cost about 1.35 million, which was 15,000 per mile, and considerably more than the Grand Canal at that particular time. But the extravagant scale of the fine harbours and aqueducts and structures were much better than the Grand Canal. The route of the canal as well, as I said, right up through Dublin, right up through Maynooth, Kilcock, Enfield, up to Thomastown, where you've got this flight of locks, into Mullingar, onto the summit level, which is from here to here, and then the extension right down to the Shannon on the western side. The canals in Dublin, here, right up through where we've got various structures going right up through, and our offices are based here at this Lock 10 on the Royal Canal. As we move out then, it explains it as well. Many fine aqueducts, as I mentioned earlier, and some of those restoration works I will actually explain to you now in 2 seconds. The restoration phases took 3 phases. We decided to go for the low hanging fruit first, and the 12th lock, Blanchardstown to Mullingar, was the first phase. Spencer Dock to the 12th lock, which was only a 6-mile stretch, which was actually very costly from the removal of all the dredged material, and Mullingar then to Richmond Harbour. Phase 1 has the statistics as outlined on your screen. And this is what we had. CIE, in their wisdom, who were the previous owners of the canal, decided to truncate the beams. So the beams were cut off so that they wouldn't be used for navigation. And then everything then disintegrated thereafter with the weeds growing up in the channel. What it looked like whenever the gates were installed by the Royal Canal Amenity Group at that time before we took over in 1986. What it looks like today, which is a bustling restaurant, 10-bedroom hotel on the left-hand side and apartments on the right-hand side. and then one of the barges, one of the heritage boat barges, travelling through the loch in one of their rallies. We are continuously making up the lock gates. We're passing on those artisan skills, which is very important. And these are lock gates that were currently installed at the 17th lock at the start of the long level. Some more of the pre-restoration. If you keep an eye on the overhead ESB lines there, and you'll see them again then with the dredge channel. Lock gates in dire need of repair and restored. Phase 2, as I said, was a 6-mile length of channel, but a lot more structures and lifting bridges and obstructions to restore. We had the Scherzer bridges at the entrance to Spencer Dock. That's a boat entering now, so it was actually navigable. Going up into Spencer Dock itself. And in Spencer Dock, we had a lot of obstructions. As I said, the Scherzer bridges at the entrance. You had the sea lock, which actually had to be reconstructed as both a navigational lock and a flood control. You had a new Lewis bridge, new transport. We had Spencer Bridge, and then we had the railway bridge up here, the Newcombe lifting bridge. So you had a lot of obstruction in this stretch, which was originally tidal, and then it was made non-tidal with the installation of these new gates. This is what it looks like today, and we've got our convention centre, the National Convention Centre, built beside the canal, and this is Spencer Dock with the moorings and the new lock control cabin there. We had one of these particular bridges, which is called a lifting or bascule type bridge, a balance bridge, which was taken out by CIE at the time. This was a drawing of it, which we have some of the drawings in the office at the moment. This is what we were left with, and hopefully nobody works with CIE here because I'm actually throwing a few curved balls at them. But they put in culverts in the canal, which meant that some boat coming through here couldn't get through the canal because these culverts. So we actually had to think about some method of taking them out. A lifting bridge was put in place, and this is the lifting bridge in the opposition and barge passing out through. It passes by our national stadium, Croke Park. You can see it there going around the new Croke Park Stadium. More pre-navigation up at the back of Mountjoy Prison, and any of you that know the Brendan Behan song, The Old Triangle Goes Jingle Jangle, it might be sung later on by people like Joe Tracy there possibly. But the prison is actually just, the prison is just actually along that wall there. And the interesting point, whenever we were dredging this particular stretch, we couldn't leave the excavators out at night time because they were hard scared they were going to be broken into, tracked up the bank, wall broken down, and there'd be a massive escape. So we actually had to bring in through that gate there into the vacuum. And anybody knows anything about prisons, and I know none of you know anything about prisons, there's a vacuum between a high wall and an inner wall. So it actually had to be parked in the vacuum. So that was laborious getting that in every evening across an old Bailey Bridge. As you can see, the wide stretches of the canal had to be bitten at and several chews. So the machine was down in the bed of the canal itself, pulled back, and then worked from the bank. And all that material had to be moved away by Moxie dumper. This is what it looks like today, the same stretch. Up at the 10th lock, the closest lock to our regional headquarters, and just in case I think I'm a real butcher altogether, you'll see the trees on the right-hand side. They're Leylandis, which are rubbish, yes. You don't have them. So I knew what I was doing, so that's what I did there, okay? So this was the canal without the gates, and this is a very important shot for me because that particular machine there called the 33M did a lot of work on the canal dredging with a 10RB machine in front of it. And that's all I was working with back in 1987 to the early 90s. So that means a lot to me, that machine going through the 10th lock fully restored. Just giving you just an example of one of the things that we actually had to remove as well, or had to construct, which was the Navan Road interchange. This is the Royal Canal. You had a railway running alongside it as well. They decided to build an interchange here, but then they decided they needed a new orbital route travelling around the outskirts of Dublin, heading from Dunleary, anybody knows it, right through to the airport. Some of you might have passed in below it, and some of you will be going on the post tour, will be visiting this structure on Thursday morning. So they decided, do we go out over that junction or do we go in below it? They decided to go in below it, and this is the next story. So we actually had to build a new viaduct for the railway, a new aqueduct for the canal, while keeping the railway live and keeping the water flowing with inverted siphons. So it was a nightmare. This was the channel itself with the fendering being put on, the Aki fendering being put on to the side of the channel. This is in partial reconstruction. This is it in another stage with that's the M50, the main motorway going in below. This is what it looked like whenever it was opened with the canal, as you can see, going out through, railway going out through, a major interchange. As I always say in giving talks like this here, England, or the Canals and River Trust, or British Waterways formerly, have a similar junction called Spaghetti Junction outside Birmingham. We call this, in Irish parlance, Tagliatelle Junction. Boats gone out through it, and this is what it looks like today, even more complicated, with a whole series of roads going out round. So, as you can see, it's fairly complicated construction, but the canal has been kept alive right through it, and that's the most important thing. Phase 3, statistics are there as well, I won't quote them. One of the examples we had as well was a lovely masonry arch bridge at Moran's Bridge. Anybody that's experienced you can come up over that bridge and you don't know what you're going to see over the other side, because you come up over the crest of the arch. So unfortunately there was an accident at that bridge, and the local authority decided, no, we'll wipe it out and we'll put in this. So the specification was that a small boat to get out through here, which was actually a small rollback weed boat. Now, I know that doesn't mean a lot about anybody, but Joe Caffrey there knows what a rollback weed boat is. So that was the specification. So you can see it's only a small boat. So we actually had to think what way we can get this solved. And the solution was, that's the small opening that was left. We moved the whole thing 6 meters upstream and created a new channel for the boats. And that's what it looks like today. And that's some of the boats heading through it, the wilderness boats. Some of the UK visitors will know the wilderness boats. Very important house on the Royal Canal project is the Loch Oul Sluice House, and this controls all the water from Loch Oul, which is the main supply for the canal. And the water flows in below that house there. My favourite man again, homegrown engineer, Mr. Kalali. As I said, his contract drawings are out there for the Royal Canal extension, and this is one of the drawings as well, showing the elevation of the aqueduct. This is the aqueduct itself. Some of the drawings that you have seen outside already. And this is more problems on the western side of Balrow at the 34th lock. Just to show that I'm not a butcher altogether, you see the trees here? The Leylandis are gone, as you well know, and we don't worry about those, but these are nice trees here, okay? And the trees are still there, okay? And as you say, that's more mature. So we had a lot of bridges to take out as well. They just put in culverted bridges. Some of the local authorities, Longford on this particular occasion, just put in culverts so you couldn't get through with the canal. This is what we actually put in place. Navigation preserved again. So I'm only showing you, there was actually 9 of these. I'm only showing you a couple of them, but there was 9 of these obstructions, each of them costing in the region of 2.25 to 2.5 million to get out. So there's another obstruction, and that's what it looks like today, looking through the eye of the new bridge. That's the two of them living in harmony, the old and the new. And this is but what costs the money is we have to super elevate the road coming up over the bridge to provide new sight lines so that you don't come out over a masonry arch bridge and see somebody before you hit them. Like Begnor Bridge, another obstruction, and because of the skew to the canal, we actually had to put in a lifting bridge at this location. So that's the lifting bridge put in, lifting bridge in the up position. Sections of lock chambers, some of them had to be rebuilt as well. I have to fly through these, I'm running out of time. So you can see the counterforts of the lock walls. You can see the chamber itself. All the blocks had to be numbered, had to be rebuilt in some occasions around the hollow coins of the of the gates themselves. Some grouting of the sills had to be carried out. You can see the extent of the work, and the lock restored, ready for action again. Very important day on the Friday, the 1st of October 2010, was another milestone in the chronological history of the Royal Canal, whenever the Royal Canal, after a culmination of 36 years of work by the Royal Canal Amenity Group and the Inland Waterways Association. As you can see there, our Minister at the time, Pat Carey, Ian Bath, it was mentioned earlier about Ruth Delaney here as well, just there, Ruth. So a very, very important day. This was the band of brothers and sisters who actually worked on that over the years. So all I can say is this is the terminus of the Royal Canal, and it's working very effectively at the moment. So our channels are channels for prosperity, and they form a real national heritage, both historically and architecturally. So just some of the uses: angling, canoeing, cycling, cycling again. So our aim for Waterways Ireland, as was said by Dawn this morning, is to manage, maintain, develop and restore the navigations under our control. So we're about to finish, and the restored Royal Canal can again be appreciated as a major engineering achievement. And John Callally, our hero, who designed and directed the construction of the Royal Canal extension, would be proud to see the canal completed in 1817, restored in 2010 to its former glory. And as the Freeman's Journal said of this son of Offaly, in the walks of his profession, he was unequalled in Ireland. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, John. I've known John for a long time, and I've spoken on various occasions with him about some of the frustrations he's suffered over the years. And while he made a kind of a quick gallop through that history of the restoration of the canal, I can tell you it wasn't all plain sailing. And we know that, John, and we really do appreciate it. I think the canal and waterways enthusiasts in Ireland owe John a huge debt of gratitude for pulling that off. Okay, we're going to take questions at the end of the session, so if you could hold your questions until then, we'll get to three presenters and we'll take questions all in one go. Our next speaker is Dr. Roger Squires. Roger was a founding member of Inland Waterways International, and he's a council member at the moment. He's a long-standing member of the IWA in the UK, and he was Deputy National Chairman for a period of time. He's a board member of the American Canals Society, and he owns a boat, so he can't be all bad. He was subsequently elected as Vice President of the St. Pancras Cruising Club, and he's a trustee of the London Canal Museum and Deputy Chairman of the Museum Board. He was awarded a British Empire Medal for services to the waterways, so well done, Roger.
Thank you.
Here we go.
Green button.
Forward, back.
Yeah. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can all hear me fairly clearly. What I want to do this afternoon is simply to give you three practical case studies. You heard Mike Palmer this morning, and he outlined the philosophy of the Waterway Recovery Group and the way they're tackling waterway restoration. I'm looking at it from the other end of the telescope and looking at how you practically go about it. I'm talking about two organisations this afternoon. One is the Wendover Arm Trust, and the other, of course, is the Navies organisation in the UK. So we'll just press ahead. The first case study I'd like to look at is reviving the Wendover Arm of the Grand Union Canal. The Wendover Arm is very similar to a couple of canals I know of in Ireland, where when they were built, water was put in and it went out quicker than it went in. The Wendover Arm wasn't quite as bad as that. It started off quite well, and then they found the water was leaking. They asphalted the centre section, which is the dotted line that you can see up here, and they thought that had cured it. The sum total is this chalk underneath. The water was just going through the chalk, and it was disappearing. So at the end of the day, the practical solution was to put in a drain underneath the canal and simply leave the canal dry, taking the water to the reservoirs by the pipeline that they inserted. And they did that in about 1906. So effectively, that dotted section on the map has been dry since 1906. The pipes were laid in the bed of the canals through the dry section, one old picture and a new picture giving you an idea of the size of the pipe that was put in. The problem was that when you dry out the canal bed, foliage takes over, trees take over, and effectively it almost disappears. The first stage was to get some water into the section at the beginning of the canal where boats could get in, but they couldn't turn round. So the Canal Trust, the Wendover Canal Trust that I mentioned, decided to put in a winding hole, and this was the first job that they did. They did this in a section that held water, but they didn't take a chance. In effect, they concreted the bottom, concreted the side, and then spread soil over the bottom to make doubly sure that nobody dropped an anchor through the concrete. So we had a new winding hole created on the Wendover Arm in 2004, and this is what it looked like in 2007, where boats could come down the first section of the arm, moor up down there, which everybody enjoyed because it's right out in the countryside, and it was a practical way of moving forward. The next problem was, how do you open the section with the chalk under the bed? This is what we started with. You had to clear out that undergrowth, and the picture alongside the undergrowth shows you how the canal bed was pulled out. I think you can see some white on the side of the picture over here. That is the underlying chalk, and I think you will appreciate that if you pour water into a chalk area like that, it will disappear fairly quickly. The practical problem was, how do the Canal Trust get the canal restored? You had the sump, which was put in with that pump that you saw in 1906, and the question was, what do? Do they try and take the old pipe out? They couldn't do that because they needed the water supply. So they left the pipe in and put a concrete capping over the pipe and then levelled off the area to make sure that they could get an even surface for putting a waterproof bed into the canal. The idea of putting a waterproof bed in the canal was to make sure that the dry section would not be dry in future. There was a new material that came onto the market called bentonite sheeting. In effect, it's a sort of bentonite clay in between two layers of artificially made Hessian-type material. And the idea was that the bentonite would expand between those two layers and actually make the waterproof lining. As you appreciate, if you put in something as delicate as that, you are opening up for trouble. So the idea was that at the canal level, they actually put in a covering over the bentonite, and you can see the blockwork in the side there. And above the water level, they put in normal earth to try and make it attractive for the walkers who walk along the canal. The problem was that people wanted mooring bays in that old dry section, so new mooring bays were created by using prefabricated concrete blocks and integrating them above the bentonite layer so that you had the waterproof lining on the outside, and then you can see at the bottom of the canal the bentonite. You put the spoil over the top to stop people damaging the bentonite, and then you get, in effect, a watertight canal. The watertight canal looked like the picture on the left-hand side, and this was the aim, to get it looking more and more like a canal. There was a small practical problem that one short area between the winding point that you saw at the beginning of the presentation and this next section, there was a bit of contamination, 1% of contamination, but the authorities went, ooh, we can't take that out, but we're finding a solution to that at the moment. So the canal, of course, had its water supply from the other end, so by actually creating the new canal from where the water supply was, you could actually fill up this section. So you actually had the old dry section with the bentonite, you reprofiled it, you put the bentonite round to make it watertight, you then put the blockwork around that and the turfing over the top, and you got the image that you see in November 2014, where the sods of grass were put out, the new banks were in, and some fill was put in the bottom of the canal. The concrete that you see in the foreground was related to the mooring bay that you saw in the earlier section. The end product was, and this is the end product in April 2015, you've got a nice canal with a lovely towpath on both sides where the walkers can enjoy, and the facility for people to start boating when they can get through that artificial problem that I mentioned earlier. Moving on to another restoration. The Waterway Recovery Group, our Navies movement, has been restoring Islay Lock on the Thames and Severn Canal. For those of you who don't put the two and two together, the Stroud water that you saw in Mike Taylor's presentation is the other end of the Thames and Severn Canal. Stroud water links into the Severn via the, trying to remember the name of it. Anyway, there is a ship canal that goes down to Sharpness. That's right, Gloucester and Sharpness. And the Thames and Severn Canal is the other end of that, where it links naturally into the Thames. You will see there was the Thames, which is the lower line in the picture. This is the Thames, and the Thames and Severn Canal was above the floodplain of the River Thames. Islay Lock is right in the centre here. Islay Lock, when the Waterway Recovery Group came in to find it, you see on the right-hand picture. And you see from the size of the tree stumps that are sitting there, it had been derelict for a substantial period of time. The Waterway Recovery Group, of course, their first job was to get rid of these tree stumps in the lock chamber. And they are exceptionally skilled at doing that with Trefoil winch, which they pull the roots out. The problem is that when you pull the root out, you're left with a gaping hole in the bed of the canal that you've got to cover over with concrete and reinforce. One of the problems with brickwork when it's had ivy over for a long time and the weather has got into it is that it actually corrodes away and crumbles into sand. So another task was to come in and get rid of that old crumbling brickwork and find the base level from which the new replacement brickwork can be created. The picture here you see on the left-hand side shows you how you have to cut it out, clean it out, before you can start rebricking. The second problem is that, of course, over the years, where those tree stumps have been and where deterioration in the wing walls of the lock has taken place, you actually have quite a job to get down to basics. The getting down to basics often means cutting out the wing walls, getting off the coping stones, and for many of you who've tried to move coping stones, 1.5 tons to move in one go isn't an easy task, but the Waterway Recovery Group have become exceptionally skilled at using the sort of pipe runners and the winches to move the old coping stones. The Waterway Recovery Group come in and they actually have work camps on various sites during the summer and set to actually try and coordinate the restoration of the work, particularly where the local canal society's resources are tremendously stretched. And in the left-hand picture you see a whole team on the summer work camp. The other problem is, of course, that you get water coming along the canal. So one of the first things you have to do is to get in some stop plank grooves. And then you have to make sure that you are ready to get the walls rebuilt. The difficulty in restoring locks is often that the sill at the top of the lock has got eroded away and new sills were put into Easy Lock as part of the reconstruction process. Modern scaffolding and hard hats were the order of the day, and this is the way in which the modern volunteer navvies work. The problem, as you have in Ireland, in England we don't have all dry days, and it's useful to have a cover if you're trying to slip in some brickwork. The problem with many of the old coping stones is that they are sort of a variety of sizes, but the aim is to try and get as many back as possible to retain the flavour of the old lock. And here you see one of the sort of modern volunteers from the Waterway Recovery Group checking the levels, and you see on the right-hand side what the lock chamber looks like after the brickwork had gone back in. The problem then was to make sure that the spillway system around the lock was operational so that you didn't get the earthworks at the side washed out. But at the end of the day, you come along and you get some gates and you put them in. The third case that I want to look at is on the Wilts and Barts Canal. The Wilts and Barts Canal near Shrivenham, where you can see the Great Western Railway line paralleled it, which took away some of its trade, was in a terrible state. Some of the bridges were absolutely shot, and an earth bund was put across the waterway. This meant that even for an accommodation bridge, you had to completely rebuild the foundations of that bridge before you could start creating a new bridge arch. Once you got the foundations in, you moved to the modern style of bridge building with metal formers over which you put wooden boarding so that you can actually get the arch ready to take the brickwork. The old style was very much a simplified version of the modern technique of putting formers in with modern scaffolding. And here you see the formers in place, and you see the woodwork, which is going to actually be the new former for the bridge in place. And then when you have got that former in place, you lay a sheeting over the top to stop the bricks sticking to the timber and enable the new brickwork to go in, which you see going in on the right-hand side. Bricking in the arch is a delicate art because, as you appreciate, it's the key stones that you put in, or the key bricks that you put in at the top of the arch, that take the stress load around the arch and enable the arch to bear the weight for which it has been designed. And therefore, in getting those keystones in that new arch, it was a tricky position, but it was a carefully organised job. And this is what the arch looked like in its rebuilding process and how the new arch was created. After you got the new arch ready, you do the wing walls to the bridge, and then you put some waterproof sheeting over the brickwork to enable it to have its new bed created over it. The bridge, of course, in a hump, has a problem for logistics of getting traffic over, so you then have to actually build up the slope to the bridge on either side. And as you see, manpower and a dumper truck is probably the best way to organise that. So here we have the grading of the surface of the new bridge and the testing of that new bridge by running a grader over it. The new bridge here, Stepping Stones Bridge on the Wilson-Barts Canal, is now looking like this. Unfortunately, the canal either side isn't quite ready for rewatering, but the bridge is there, and it means that the farmer has got his access to his fields, and it is one less obstacle for the restoration of the Wilson-Barts Canal. So we've had a look at 3 case studies, each looking at modern techniques for restoring waterways. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Roger. That was very interesting, giving us some insights into how you solve a number of detailed problems that arise in canal restorations. And I thought the last one was particularly interesting because it reflected something that was said earlier on today about sometimes in these projects you just do the bits that you can and you sort of work around the issues until such times as you find a solution. And as Mike Palmer so inelegantly said, you know, people do die eventually and maybe the problems will just go away with them. And I remember actually referring back to the Royal Canal, that the late and great Eddie Slane, who was the champion of the Royal Canal for so many years, asking Eddie, I think in fact it was about Moran's Bridge, and Eddie said, don't worry about it, we'll find a solution when the time comes. And he said, just keep going. Okay, our next speaker is Pam Veinotte. She's been a long-time employee of Parks Canada in many different managerial positions in communications, marketing, tourism, in Atlantic Canada and the Mountain National Parks. And since 2006, she's been a member of the executive team responsible for areas such as southern New Brunswick, and I'm afraid I can't read that bit. Pamela introduced that herself. In 2012, she left her position as field superintendent to head Toronto to lead the creation of the Rouge National Urban Park, a new type of area managed by Parks Canada. So most recently, she has become acting executive director responsible for Parks Canada's Ontario and Waterways in Ontario and Quebec region. So, Pam.
Well, hello everyone, and it's great to be here in Ireland. Even though I have been a long-time employee of Parks Canada, this is my first time at the World Canals Conference, and I'll just find the clicker. It's right in front of me. And I'm going to go through a number of things this afternoon, but really talking about what's happened to our canals since they ceased to be used for commercial navigation. And they have become recreational havens and paradises and major tourist attractions in their own rights. They are situated in natural watersheds, environmental watersheds as well. And so this also not only provides wonderful opportunities for the people who use them, but it also means that when we do our asset projects, there's many environmental considerations that we have to keep in mind. And because now centuries old, they are now having to be, to evolve to meet modern needs. And certainly we do this to provide, yes, wonderful recreational opportunities, but doing so to preserve the heritage character and also the natural and cultural landscapes in which they exist. Just a bit about Parks Canada, for those of you who don't know about our organization. We are actually the world's oldest national park service, and we manage a whole diverse collection of protected areas from national parks, national historic sites, national marine conservation areas, and of course, heritage and historic canals. And collectively, our places welcome more than 20 million visitors in any given year. As far as canals are concerned, Parks Canada, the national organization, manages 9 historic canals. Most of these are located naturally in the central part of Canada, in the provinces of Ontario and Quebec, although we do have one canal in Nova Scotia on Cape Breton Island, the St. Peter's Canal. I won't be talking about that one today, but because Nova Scotia is my home province, it's near and dear to me as well. Like a lot of the canals, ours began in the 17th century, where 3 locks were established at the Ste. Marie among the Hurons in Ontario. Our major period of canal building was, of course, in the 1800s. We had the work on the Lachine Canal. It was finished around 1825. We had the Rideau in 1836. The Trent Severn, another one of our major canals, was obviously a little bit later, and it's went from the mid-1800s into the early 1900s. And of course, they were major transportation routes used both by the military and then also commercial, for commercial shipping. And then that operation ceased to exist about the mid-19 or the later part of the 1900s. But our canals were very quickly and very early designated for their heritage value and heritage character. Just to give you an idea of some of the structures that can be found along the canals, and the one in the middle I just would point your attention to, because it's the Big Chute Marine Railway on the Trent Severn. Certainly, having been there when I was a child, it left me with a lot of memories, and it certainly is quite a feat of engineering to take boats from the Severn River and into Georgian Bay, and that has seen a lot of traffic over the years. So now I want to move to talk a little bit about what's been happening with our canal assets. Our assets are, of course, dominated by locks, bridges, and dams. And these are integral to canal operation and also the water management that we as Parks Canada have to deal with in terms of all the different waterways and the communities that are linked and served by our canals. After centuries of use and limited funding for maintenance and asset replacement and recapitalization, and that's a story we've all heard, the condition of many of these assets had deteriorated significantly, and they were in danger of malfunction or in some cases even collapse, and they certainly weren't able to continue for long to be able to service the type of use and the level of use that we have. But thankfully, very recently, and of course we did have capital budgets over the years, but they were tended to be very insufficient. But thankfully, back in 2014, the Government of Canada recognized this significant issue and gave us an unprecedented budget for all of Parks Canada's assets, $3 billion to be spent on replacement, recapitalization, and renewal. The canals received just over $1 billion of that amount. So that, of course, changed the game in terms of what we were now able to do. And so that really has helped us in our efforts, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that now. So I can't go into all of the challenges today, but I want to talk about some of the renewal challenges related to safety standards, water management and flood response, changing demographics, and public expectations. And certainly, some of my colleagues in Parks Canada, Joel and Lauren, are going to be dealing with some of these aspects. But I want to talk about these things, starting with safety standards, and I'll go into each of these. And of course, the specifications that our projects must meet and the costs of the projects related to replacing and renewing these infrastructure. It could be the additional lanes on bridges, or to be able to support greater weights, or to add guardrails, anchor restraint systems, lighting systems, whatever. We have high code standards, and of course those have to be, and they should be followed, and that has to be taken into consideration. In terms of climate change, we've had incredible impact. Just recently in 17 was one of our worst years. We've seen frequent, severe weather. We don't even think about in a decade or even 100 years anymore because they're coming so frequently now. And that, of course, is causing damage to infrastructure, and it's also having low and high water levels and great effects on us as park managers, but also the community residents. Users and residents want to be assured of up-to-date information. They want real-time information. They want reduced wait times. And their ideas of maybe water management don't always match all of the realistic things that we can or cannot do. And of course, because our canals weren't built for the traffic that they're experiencing today, visitors have larger boats, they're more urban, a more diverse audience. And what we're seeing today is there's more inexperienced canal users as well. But happily, they want to learn, they want to canoe, kayak, cycle, walk along the canals, as well as, of course, importantly, boat. And these changing demographics are having an impact on our operations. So how have we adapted? Well, we've, over the past decade, and more recently as part of our investment program, we have become more responsive to visitors. We're offering innovative experiences, and we're engaging with our residents and the communities more frequently and in more meaningful ways. And we are, of course, taking extensive measures to ensure the safety of our workers and our visitors and our users, and to reduce risk. And we're certainly trying to deal better with the severe weather we're having. So in terms of changing demographics, just to show you one thing from actually the 1970s, where we did replace the marine railway to accommodate more boats and more of them at once. And so that kind of started some of this thinking on what we could do. And obviously, we're seeing more mechanization. We're also, and that's helping with wait times and to speed up things. We're also also constructing pedestrian and cycling paths, and all of these are usually done in partnership with the municipalities in which we operate. And to accommodate what some of you have already heard and talked about is the growing paddling clientele, we're also installing docks to allow users to launch canoes and kayaks. We've also made tremendous gains when it comes to programming and also partnerships. Special events not only help community residents connect to our places, but they also bring new audiences. Two that I just want to mention, the middle picture is the Peterborough Lift Lock. We do a dining experience there, and believe me, that's an experience. On the right is, top right, is the Red Bull crushed ice event, crashed ice event, not crushed ice. I'm thinking about my whiskey already. And that is obviously a high speed event on skates down the part of the Rideau Canal. That was in 2017. We've also been starting to accommodate people on the land to get off their boats or to come and just camp by the canals in wall tents that we call authentiques, or even in an old lockmaster's house that we've renovated. We've got partnerships with commercial operators, including most recently on the Rideau, the Le Boat. And the picture on the bottom right is in Montreal on the Lachine Canal, where we've worked with the arts and culture scene to have old metro cars renovated, and they're used for art installations, music venues, cafes, artisan shops, etc. I was mentioning about engaging the public, and we've certainly upped our communications and information. We're using traditional and non-traditional methods, very important because not everybody wants it in the same way. So we have and regular community updates to give people this information that they need on water levels, wait times, construction projects, etc. And we've also, and someone was saying this earlier about getting out and getting people involved in the project development at the conception stage so that residents and other users can provide that input and help make for successful projects. So an example of this are two projects, one on the Rideau Canal, the Burt's Rabbit Swing Bridge, where what we did was we arranged for a pedestrian crossing to be installed during construction. And then because the construction was a little delayed and navigation season was starting, we had to modify that pedestrian crossing to allow for a portion of it to be removed so that the boats could go through during operating hours, but then again the pedestrians could have access again. So that's one example. In Montreal at the Lachine, of course we know that whenever we have vehicles, pedestrians, cyclists together, it doesn't always work. So they've recently finished a project to conduct a new path under the Charlevoix Bridge, and this allows cyclists to bypass the street and the bridge. And all these things are based on what we see, but also the public input that we're getting to these projects. In terms of flood response and safety, it means considering factors in every capital project that we take on, and as well in our day-to-day maintenance function. And certainly for workers, this means looking at how they work, safe work practices, widening the workspace where possible, making sure that we put non-slip surfaces on decks, that we add anchor bolts to make and scaffolding to make sure that the work that they do, and lighting at nighttime because of this time frame of 4 years that we have for our capital projects. We often have to get people working at night, so this is really important. For the users, more signage, guardrails, non-slip surfaces, and all of this really helps us not only meet code, but make sure that we reduce risk and keep our people safe. In terms of flooding, we're trying to anticipate and plan for frequent severe weather and major weather events now by building better dams, guard gates to allow water to be diverted, and ways to protect our critical infrastructure on our canals, but also in the communities. Here's two great examples of some of our flood response and safety projects. On the right is the Scotts Mill Dam recapitalization, which is just in the design phase, and that's going to really consider maintenance function to widen the decks, add guardrails, as I mentioned, and all of this to reduce risk. On the left is a really interesting one that's underway right now on the Trent Severn as well, and it is scheduled for completion in 2019, and it's the Nassau Guard Gate. We're installing protective gates within the waterway, as well as creating an earthen berm closely following the contours of the road. So the guard gate's been designed for a very major significant flooding event, and it would allow Parks Canada to redirect the water to the Otonabee River, thereby protecting the homes, businesses, and other infrastructure in nearby Peterborough. So, what's on the horizon? Well, we can only anticipate so many things. However, that's what we're trying to do. One thing that's certain is there will be change, and so we need to stay ahead of things as much as possible to respond to continuing changes in both code, safety codes, and also visitor demographics. We also need to really make our infrastructure and our operations as resilient as we can in the face of climate change and what is happening now, but what can be expected to come in the future. We also know that we need to continue to adapt and take advantage of new technology because it too is coming, and whether we're talking about ways of engaging or communicating or ways to build bigger, better bridges, dams, ways to better operate our canals, these are the things that we'll be adopting and incorporating as we continue to operate. And finally, and I think it's really important, and that's why this emphasis that we have on our users, community residents, and volunteers where possible is so important, because we need to get people knowledgeable, aware of what's going on for starters, then knowledgeable, and then engage, because only with that will we have the support that we need to not only be the agency that operates these wonderful places, but also that we continue to involve the public in being successful. And whether it's the private sector from a commercial aspect, nonprofit organizations perhaps on many special events, it's also the community residents and frankly our core users that are so very important to the successful evolution and operation of our canals. So thank you very much for your time. And I'd like to point out my colleagues. Lauren is in charge of our canals in Quebec. Trevor's in our national office. And some of you know Jewel. She's presenting in the other room, who's in charge of our Ontario canals. So thank you again, and I'll see you over the course of the conference.
Thank you very much, Pam. That was fascinating. It was very interesting to hear the way the Parks Canada are working to keep their all those various assets safe and available for all of us. And personally, I have very fond memories of visiting a number of those sites over the years, so I'm delighted you're doing that work well. I'd like to just at this point thank all the speakers for their timekeeping. It was absolutely, I didn't have to use my red card once, it was fantastic. But I'd like to invite the three speakers.
You told us you would tell us to shut up.
I did. I'd like to invite our three speakers now to come up, and we'll take some questions from the floor. I think we have about 10 minutes. Have we the first speaker over the far side?
You can probably hear me anyway. Basically, the waterway movement, the voluntary waterway movement in the UK is based on the individual canal societies that are there to foster the rejuvenation of their canals. So this means that the Wendover Arm Trust actually raised money to get their work done. This is why it sometimes takes so long, because money raising is difficult. And the way they do it is to look for Heritage Lottery grants for equipment and machinery. You approach contractors to see whether they would lend their equipment for free over the weekend. And very often it's actually purchasing the supplies, the volunteers doing the rest, and you simply provide them with tea to keep them going. The Waterway Recovery Group that you heard Mike talk about works very much on the same basis. It says to the individual societies, if you would like us to come in, we will provide the manpower and even provide the tea urn, but we want you to pay for the raw materials. Now, paying for raw materials can be done in multitudes of ways, but it all comes down to prioritising the work, identifying the opportunities for cash flow, and then working within your cash flow. This is why the Wendover Trust has taken so long to get the dry section concreted out, the bentonite in, and the new banks. You sometimes get the googly thrown when, how can I put it, a hygiene advisor comes along and finds something that shouldn't be in the soil where the old canal line was filled in. That's what's happened on the Wendover Canal, and they've got a little bit of negotiation to do to find a way around that problem. And it looks as if they will find a way around the problem by digging out a new route for the canal around the problem and concreting off the side where the problem is. Does that answer your question? Yes, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Roger. Have we another question here in the middle?
Thank you. Joe Tracy, Heritage Boat Association. One of those that use and hopefully don't abuse the canals that have been reopened. If John's hero was Killally, John is our hero, and the Royal Canal. My question is about technology, progress, and cost, ultimately. So the Royal opened in 2010. In 2011, I was slightly involved in a TV programme, the last of the Waterway series with the late Dick Warner. Quite a big part of the budget was spent on helicopters and airplanes and booms and whatnot for camera shots that would have all been much cheaper nowadays with drones. So with the Ulster Canal and the other canals, is technology going to, A, make it cheaper, and is it taken into account in budgets at the moment? Thank you.
I'm assuming you're meaning in relation to restoration, technology for restoration, rather than sort of us using drones, as we do use drones at the present moment in time, and we have several of our operators trained in doing that as well. Probably not, Joe, because, particularly in restoring the canals, what we saw with the Royal Canal, there's the sensitivities of the bed that you're dealing with, the dredging. So you still can't just go in and dredge willy-nilly. You actually have to dredge with sympathy. Using gummy buckets, for example, you actually have to have experienced people actually knowing exactly what they're doing. They're not digging holes in the canal. Because we're restoring a canal back to its former glory 200 years ago, in most cases, we're not using ram-operated gates. We're using the old racks and pinion gearing, all the castings, which some of you will see tomorrow. Anybody goes on the east trip tomorrow to Tullamore, you'll see all those artisan skills. And that's something that I'm very passionate about, is actually passing on those artisan skills for future generations. So does technology help us? Technology does help us probably in the type of machinery that we can use, but you'll see even with the Yaqui timber that's used in lock gates, it's the way I describe it, it's like Toblerone. You plane it one way and the grain rises, but it's down in one way. You plane it the other way, the same thing happens. So you actually have to finish it by hand. So all the modern technology in the world still has to be finished by hand. So I think there's more probably like, I think Roger had some bog misers, for example, for terraining on low profile and boggy banks. So there's new technology that can be used for that sort of thing. But I still think it's a slow process, a determined process in order to try and maintain what we have to a high standard.
Thank you, John. Have we another question? In the front here, sorry. And then Sean.
Just a question for Roger. I'm with Waterways Ireland. I work on the Barrow navigation system, which you probably got introduction to in the main brief. Just, Roger, the question of engaging other stakeholders in it. In Ireland, we have a huge compensation culture. So if we were to get navies, how did you manage that in England, where you got people occasionally in for weekends or for camps, and God forbid someone suffer an injury, were they compensated, or was there insurance infrastructure for them there to, to quicker work?
The Navies is part of the Inland Waterways Association, and therefore it has a comprehensive insurance policy. But quite clearly, all work has to be undertaken with a clear risk analysis, and you have to follow what that risk analysis identifies. Each of the individual canal societies also have their own insurance policies, although invariably they tack on to the Inland Waterways Association policy. But at the end of the day, you have to do the risk analysis, you have to set out the procedures that you expect people to undertake, and you have to make sure that properly trained operatives are there. And one thing that the Navies movement or the Waterway Recovery Group does is hold weekend training courses to give people the necessary skills and raise them up to a standard where they can be certificated to ride a dumper truck, to use a chainsaw, or whatever is necessary. It's not simply casting people into the job without giving them the appropriate training. At the end of the day, it has got to be an operation where all work together to optimise safety, get the job done, and get enjoyment for the volunteers.
Thank you. We've time for one more quick question. John had his hand up.
Hello. Question for John about the Royal Canal. And I was asking your guys at Richmond Harbour on the pre-trip, well, if you've got a boat there, can you just go up the Royal anytime and stop whenever you want? And they were saying, well, I suppose you could, but we really like to manage the boats going along because we use the locks for water management, and some of them might need to set paddles after boats gone through and so on. I presume this is because maybe some of the locks don't have bywashers and so on. Have you got any plan to make it easier to let people use the canals without supervision? Because I think one of the things about the Royal, I mean, accepting that the railway lift bridge in Dublin, it's obviously a problem. But as far as the rest of the canal's concerned, you'd get a lot more boats on it, wouldn't you, if people could just come and go as they pleased, rather than having to sort of make bookings and things like that?
One of the problems is in entering the Royal Canal, you have to go through one of those lift bridges that I showed, the Veinotte lift bridge. Now, it's a complicated structure from the point of view that it can be mechanized, but we usually always have it manually operated. The biggest problem that we have in the Royal Canal, and anybody that's navigated it recently, is water. Is actually a secured water supply. We're hopeful over the coming years, with probably alternative water from other sources, that we may have a sustainable water supply for the Royal. But for this last 2 seasons, the summit level, which is fed by Lough Oul, a big lake, have actually been down. So it's all about water management. And whenever we're trying to get rallies through, we're keeping up the level in the summit level, which supplies east and west. And we're actually then pushing the water down the system to take them down onto the Shannon again. So water is a scarcity. We look after water. We have had in Ireland exceptional weather over this summer. We've had hose pipe bans. At one stage we had bread shortages because of the snow, and now we had sun and water shortages. So, it's not an ideal place to live at the present moment in time with climatic changes. So we're actually managing the water. So that's the reason why we like to know boat movements in the Royal. Yes. Yeah, I know. It'll be much easier, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I'd like you to show your appreciation for our 3 speakers, Pam, Roger, and John, in the usual way. And as a token of our appreciation to the 3 speakers, we're nothing if not generous with our gifts. I'd like to offer each of our 3 speakers a burgee from the conference. Proudly from your boat, or hang it in your kitchen window, or whatever. Okay, thank you very much. The next session starts at 3:15, and again the same layout. You're either in this room, the one beside us, or over on the far side. So if everybody would like to go and have a cup of coffee, we'll see you then.
That's our national body.
Oh, yes.
It's called in. That's the Fire Brigade, and that's a magazine, Canal Society, and it talks about the work that they do.
Thank you so much.
That's a pleasure.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Good. All right, David.
If you're coming back to this one, yeah. Well done, thank you. We got away with it.